Bonjour and welcome to the Hawkeye Rising YouTube channel. Thank you for joining me. A couple of items. Thank you for listening to my material. This is new for me and it's not my forte. Speaking and speech is not one of my strengths. You can probably tell. However, it is heartfelt conviction and a jab in the ribs or two by the captain that compels me to research, learn, and share this material. It's got to go somewhere. It's got to go somewhere. It needs to be published. It needs to be known. To add, I love my country. I even considered enlisting after high school graduation into the military. Instead after graduation, I chose to see my country firsthand and hitchhiked and walked from coast to coast in the mid-90s. I walked into and around the Gaspé Peninsula, which is part of the location of where we are currently studying and exploring the subject matter. I love my country. Let's get started. This first portion is from The Mariner of St. Malo by Stephen Leacock. I'll leave a link in the notes below. I'll start with page 10. This will be continuing with exploring who Jacques Cartier was. There's a lot of information. Getting to know the man through different, multiple sources has definitely been an adventure in its own right. So, again, let's begin. Page 10. What voyages Cartier actually made before he suddenly appears in history as a pilot of the King of France and the protege of the High Admiral of France, we do not know. This position in itself, and the fact that at the time of his marriage in 1519 he had already the rank of master pilot, would show that he had made the Atlantic voyage. There is some faint evidence that he had even been to Brazil. For the account of his first recorded voyage, he makes a comparison between the maize of Canada and that of South America, and in those days this would scarcely have occurred to a writer who had not seen both plants of which he spoke. Quoting, "There groweth likewise," so runs the quaint translation that appears in Hakluyt's Voyages, a kind of millet as big as peas, like unto that which groweth in Brazil. And later on, in the account of his second voyage, he repeats the reference to Brazil. Then goodly and large fields which he saw on the present site of Montreal recalled to him the millet fields of Brazil. It is possible, indeed, that not only had he been in Brazil, but that he had carried a native of that country to France. In a baptismal register of St. Malo is recorded the christening in 1528 of a certain Catherine of Brazil, to whom Cartier's wife stood godmother. We may, in fancy at least, suppose that this forlorn little savage with the regal title was a little girl whom the navigator, after the fashion of his day, had brought home as living evidence of the existence of the strange lands that he had seen. Page 11. Out of this background, then, of uncertainty and conjecture emerges in 1534 Jacques Cartier, a master pilot in the prime of his life, now sworn to the service of His Most Christian Majesty Francis I of France, and about to undertake on behalf of his illustrious master a voyage to the new land. Chapter 2. The First Voyage, Newfoundland and Labrador. It was on April 20th, 1534. Let's remember April 20th. We'll come back to that. It was on April 20th, 1534 that Jacques Cartier sailed out of the port of St. Malo on his first voyage in the service of Francis I. Before leaving their anchorage, the commander, the sailing masters, and the men took an oath administered by Charles de Moy, Vice Admiral of France, Admiral of France, that they would behave themselves truly and faithfully in the service of the most Christian king. The company were borne in 2 ships, each of about 60 tons burden, and numbered in all 61 souls. The passage across the ocean was pleasant. Fair winds blowing fresh and strong from the east carried the clumsy caravels westward on the foaming crests of the Atlantic surges. Within 20 days of their departure, the ice-bound shores of Newfoundland rose before their eyes. Straight in front of them was Cape Bonavista, the Cape of Happy Vision, already known and named by the fishermen explorers who had welcomed the sight of its projecting headlands after the weary leagues of unbroken sea. But approach to the shore was impossible. The whole coastline was blocked with the great store of ice that lay against it. The ships ran southward and took shelter in a little haven about 5 leagues south of the cape, to which Cartier gave the name St. Catherine's Haven, either in fond remembrance of his wife or, as is more probable, in recognition of the help and guidance of St. Catherine, whose natal day, April 30th, had fallen midway in his voyage. The harbourage is known today as Catalina, and lies distant as the crow flies about 80 miles northwestward of the present city of St. John's in Newfoundland. Here the mariners remained 10 days, looking for fair weather, and engaged in mending and dressing their boats. At this time, it must be remembered, the coast of Newfoundland was, in some degree, already known. Ships had frequently passed through the narrow passage of Belle-Île that separates Newfoundland from the coast of Labrador. Of the waters, however, that seemed to open up beyond, or of the exact relation of Newfoundland coastline to the rest of the great continent, nothing accurate was known. It might well be that the inner waters behind the inhospitable headlands of Belle-Île would prove the gateway to the great empires of the East. Cartier's business, at any rate, was to explore, to see all that could be seen, and to bring news of it to his royal master. This he set himself to do, with persevering thoroughness. That was the secret of his final success. He coasted along the shore from cape to cape and from island to island, sounding and charting as he went, noting the shelter for ships that might be found, and laying down the bearing of the compass from point to point. It was his intent, good pilot as he was, that those who sailed after him should find it easy to sail on these coasts. From St. Catherine's Harbour, the ship sailed on May 21st with a fine offshore wind that made it easy to run on course almost due north. As they advanced on this course, the mainland sank again from sight, but presently they came to an island. It lay far out in the sea, and was surrounded by a great upheaval of jagged and broken ice. On it and around it they saw so dense a mass of birds that no one, declares Cartier, could have believed it who had not seen it for himself. The birds were as large as jays. They were colored black and white, and they could scarcely fly because of their small wings and their exceeding fatness. The modern inquirer will recognize, perhaps, the great auk which one abounded on the coast, but which is now extinct. The sailors killed large numbers of the birds and filled 2 boats with them. Then the ship sailed on rejoicing from the island of Burge with 6 barrels full of salted provisions added to their stores. Cartier's island of Burge is the Funk Island of our present maps. The ships now headed west and north to come into touch with land again. To the great surprise of the company, they presently met a huge polar bear swimming in the open sea, and evidently heading for the tempting shores of the island of Birds. The bear was as great as any cow and as white as a swan. The sailors lowered boots in pursuit, and captured by main force the bear, which supplied a noble supper for the captors. Its flesh, wrote Cartier, was as good to eat as any heifer of 2 years. Changing texts. by Canada at the Foundations of Its Future. I've read from this before, by Stephen Leacock. Chapter 2. The settlement of New France, like that of New England, does not begin until the 17th century, which brought actual and permanent colonization by Champlain, by the Puritans, and by the Virginia Company. But a prelude to this settlement is found in the preceding voyages of Jacques Cartier, in the opening by both French and English of the Newfoundland fisheries, and in the unsuccessful attempts at colonization made by Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh. The voyages of Jacques Cartier came as an interlude in the unending wars of Europe, preceded by the wars in which France and Spain struggled for the conquest of Italy, and followed by the long series of wars called, with unconscious irony, the Wars of Religion. In this pause, the restless and energetic Francis I of France, the king who has left to the world after his defeat at Pavia the immortal phrase, "All is lost but honor," found a new field for honor and to occupy. He turned his eager ambition towards overseas empire and the western route to Asia. This last was, so to speak, the grand prize that such a sovereign as Francis I would naturally covet. The first commission given to Jacques Cartier, a St. Malo pilot recommended to the king by his admiral, has not been preserved. But other documents show that voyages of Cartier and of Roberval, his later associate and superior, aimed at the expected opening up of Asia by way of the Western Sea. The discovery of the St. Lawrence and of Hochelaga only strengthened this belief, or at least led the pilots to make capital of it. The new commission to Cartier after his great discovery speaks of Canada and Hochelaga as forming one end of Asia in the direction of the west. But higher purposes and more real ambitions were mingled with this search for imaginary empire. For Cartier himself, the conversion of the savages to the Christian faith was throughout a leading motive, as witness his setting up of the great cross at Gaspé. Moreover, the prospect of treasure from America itself presently became as bright as the vague vision of Cathay. We are told in the opening of the narrative of Cartier's third voyage that King Francis enjoined him to attain the knowledge of the country of the Saguenay, where they are, as it is declared, great riches and very good countries. Such is the background of the famous voyages of Jacques Cartier, which remain, in spite of their confused and uncertain terminations, one of the great episodes of world history. The first voyage in 1534 was little more than a reconnaissance. Cartier left St. Malo on April 20th, 1534, with 2 ships, each of about 60 tons, and, in all, a company of 61 men. They sailed across the Newfoundland waters in 3 weeks and passed through the Strait of Belle-Isle and into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There was nothing unusual or novel about this. For a whole generation already, the fishermen of 4 nations had flocked to these grounds. Cartier himself, after he passed the strait, met a large ship from Rochelle, looking for anchorage, but his design was to continue westward beyond the familiar coastal fishing ground and to find the passage to Asia. Cartier followed the north shore of the Gulf a little way westward from the strait. He found it empty and desolate. I believe he wrote in his narrative that this was the land that God allotted to Cain. This sounds like a jest, the first, the original of the jokes on Canada, but it is not. After the pious fashion of the age, Cartier meant what he said. He had found where Cain went to, and he quite understood it. He left this shore in disgust, turned south along Newfoundland, then struck out westward across the Gulf past the Magdalens and along the west end of Prince Edward Island. Here was a different country indeed, a land of delight. It is the fairest land, he said, that could possibly be seen, full of goodly meadows and trees. He skirted the New Brunswick coast and beyond it, on the Gaspé Peninsula, set up a tall wooden cross 30 feet high, carrying a shield and 3 fleurs-de-lis, and at the top the legend "Vive le Roi de France." The scene remains in our history, a picture that never fades. And to continue, here and there the explorers saw Indians, especially on the warm waters that Cartier called Baie de Chaleur and on Gaspé. They were friendly, frightened people, half naked, and so destitute that Cartier thought they must be the poorest in the world. He noted that they had their heads shaved except for a tuft on top of the crown, as long as a horse's tail. The ominous meaning of the scalp lock was as yet fortunately hidden from the Frenchmen. Cartier crossed to Anticosti, rounded the east end of the island, and made his way westward along the north shore. Where the island ends, rough winds and adverse currents blocked his advance. But in turning back, he at least felt sure that he had found a westward passage. His homeward voyage was through the Strait of Belle-Isle, for as yet he knew no other way out of the Gulf. In spite of terrific storms from the east that delayed him in mid-ocean, he reached St. Malo September 15th, 1 month after sailing from the North Shore. Let's back up the bus, or rather back up the ship, in narrative. From the Canadian Encyclopedia, it summarizes, Jacques Cartier then navigated towards the west, crossing Chaleur Bay and reaching Gaspé, where he encountered Iroquois-speaking Aboriginal people from the region of Quebec, who had come to the area for their annual seal hunt. After the planting across and engaging in some trading and negotiations, Cartier's ships left on 25th of July with 2 of the Iroquois Chief Donnacona's sons and returned to France by following the coast of Anticosti Island and recrossing the Strait of Belle-Isle, so on and so forth. From another source, Donnacona, chief of Stadaconan until May 1536, taken into exile by Jacques Cartier along with 2 sons, skipping down in July 1534 in Gaspé Bay. Jacques Cartier entered into relations with Indians who had come from Stadacona or Quebec to fish. When Cartier erected a cross there on July 24th, 1534, their chief, Donnacona, felt that he had been wronged. He harangued the French. His canoe was seized and he was forced to go aboard the ship along with those who were accompanying him. Cartier feasted him and persuaded him to let his 2 sons, Domagaya and Taignoagny, sail away with him, promising to bring them back. The French needed to train interpreters. Donnacona accepted and his 2 sons left for France. Donnacona's sons spent 8 months in France and sailed again with Cartier on May 19, 1535, without, however, having been baptized. They had learned French, they were able to give valuable information about the country, and thanks to them, Cartier discovered in 1535 the great river which he had missed the previous year. Under the guidance of his 2 interpreters, Cartier sailed up the river and took the route to Canada. ... We'll find another source. Another source says, Jacques was a practicing French Catholic. Consequently, in his explorations of Canada, he treated Native Americans, for the most part, with kindness and integrity. He made a point of sharing the gospel with them and perpetrated few of the cruelties that were so common in Latin America and would later occur among other North Americans. His worst act seems to have been to capture 2 Indians for display to France. Back to Stephen Leacock's The Mariner of St. Malo. From time to time the explorers had caught sight of painted savages, with heads adorned with bright feathers, and with bodies clad in the skins of wild beasts. They were roving upon the shore or passing in light boats made of bark among the island channels of the coast. They are men, wrote Cartier, of an indifferent good stature and bigness, but wild and unruly. They wear their hair tied on top like a wreath of hay and put a wooden pin within it, or any other such thing instead of a nail. And with them they bind certain birds' feathers. They are clothed with beasts' skins, as well the men as women, but that the women go somewhat straighter and closer in their garments than the men do, with their waists girded. They paint themselves with certain roan colors. Their boats are made with bark of birch trees, with the which they fish and take great store of seals, and, as far as we can understand since our coming, that is not their habitation, but they come from the mainland out of hotter countries to catch the said seals and other necessaries for the living. There has been much discussion as to these savages. It has been thought by some that they were a southern branch of the Eskimo, by others that they were Algonquin Indians who had wandered eastward from the St. Lawrence region. But the evidence goes to show that they belonged to the lost tribe of the Red Indians of Newfoundland, quote-unquote Red Indians of Newfoundland, the race which met its melancholy fate by deliberate and ruthless destruction at the hands of the whites. John Cabot had already seen these people on his voyage to the coast and described them as painted with red ochre. 3 of them had been captured and taken to England as an exhibit. For 200 years after the English settlement in Newfoundland, these quote-unquote Red Indians were hunted down till they were destroyed. It was considered meritorious, says a historian of the island, to shoot a Red Indian. To go to look for Indians came to be as much a phrase as to look for partridges. They were harassed from post to post, from island to island. Their hunting and fishing stations were unscrupulously seized by the invading English. They were shot down without the least provocation and captured to be exposed as curiosities to the rabble at fairs in the western towns of Christian England at 2 pence apiece. So much for the ill-fated savages among whom Cartier planted his first cross. Page 28. July 1st, 1534, found the vessels lying off the northern end of Prince Edward Island. Here they lowered the boats and searched the shoreline for a suitable anchorage. As they rowed along, a savage was seen running upon the beach and making signs. The boats were turned towards him, but, seized with sudden panic, he ran away. Cartier landed a boat and set up a little staff in the sand with a wooden girdle and a knife as a present for the fugitive and a mark of goodwill. Cartier's boats explored the northern end of Prince Edward Island for many miles. All that he saw delighted him. We went that day on shore, he wrote in his narrative, in 4 places to see the goodly, sweet and smelling trees that were there. We found them to be cedars, yews, pines, white elms, ash, willows, with many other sorts of trees to us unknown, but without any fruit. The grounds were where no wood is very fair, and all full of peas, white and red gooseberries, strawberries, blackberries, and wild corn, even like unto rye, which seemed to have been sowed and ploughed. This country is of better temperature than any other land that can be seen, and very hot. There are many thrushes, stock doves, and other birds. To be short, there wanteth nothing but good harbours. On page 34, another account of meeting the indigenous. Here again they saw savages in great numbers, but belonging, so Cartier concluded, to a different tribe from those seen on the bay below. We gave them knives, he wrote, combs, beads of glass, and other trifles of small value, for which they made many signs of gladness, lifting their hands up to heaven, dancing and singing in their boats. They appeared to be a miserable people, in the lowest stage of savagery, going about practically naked, and owning nothing of any value except their boats and the fishing nets. He noted that their heads were shaved except for a tuft on top of the crown, as long as a horse's tail. Cartier thought, from their destitute state, that there could be no poorer people in the world. Another source. This initial encounter between Cartier and the people of Stadaconan lasted for 8 days, during which time gifts were exchanged, and the French gave the natives inexpensive goods like knives, combs, bells, and rosaries. An article titled A 16th Century International Kidnapping, written by Ed Beaumont, writes, in the summer of 1534, roughly 200 men, women, and children left their homes in the village of Stadaconan, heading towards the Atlantic coast. This was a long trek, an extended back-country camping trip covering hundreds of kilometers. The Stadaconans had only what they carried with them, notably the clothes on their back, some tools including fishing nets, and their canoes, which doubled as shelter when flipped upside down. This was an annual pilgrimage, one shared by not only by the Amerindians heading east, but also by Europeans sailing west. For many years before any sort of colonization or even real diplomatic contact began, fishermen and women from these two almost alien worlds met and intermingled in the fertile grounds of the Atlantic coast, focused on the common goal of bringing food back home. Among the 200 Stadaconans on this particular trip was likely the Aguana or chief. His name was Donnacona. We do not know how old Donnacona was during this time, though he was an older man and had at least 2 adult sons who are important to our story, Domagaya and Taignoagny. We have some difficulty in deciphering these specifics. Our main source of this voyage are the journals of Jacques Cartier, written by him or possibly another sailor on this voyage. Do we know for sure that Domagaya or Taignoagny were the sons of Donnacona, given that our source did not speak the language? Do we even know for sure that Donnacona was one person? He's only referred to as Aguana at first, and given a name later. We cannot be certain. I seek here to tell the story that is more congruent, complete, and logical. Often, with history, that is the best we can do. This was not a peaceful time for the Stadaconans. For years they had fought a series of battles against their rivals to the south, but they appeared to complete this particular journey unmolested. Despite how they might first appear, traveling as they are, the Stadaconans did not simply spend their days wandering the wilderness. Their village was comprised of several longhouses, surrounded by a wall, as well as farmland where they'd grow corn, beans, and squash. When they left their village in large numbers, as we see them doing now, they do not to simply wander about, but go forward with intent. It is the fishing season, and they are going to their favorite fishing spots. Donnacona, Domagaya, and Taignoagny and another 200-ish people left their homes in the summer of 1534, traveling down the St. Lawrence until they reached Gaspé Bay. It was here, fishing for mackerel, that they encountered a small band of European explorers. This was not necessarily Donnacona's first contact with Europeans. However, particular groups of Europeans included the man who would change and ruin Donnacona's life forever, Jacques Cartier. So we arrive at this point in the narrative. Multiple sources give different accounts or ignore it. One thing we do know for certain, Jacques Cartier's first voyage, when turning back to Europe from North America, he had on board Donnacona's 2 sons. Picking up with Leacock's The Mariner of St. Malo, soon the ships were heading along the northern shore of the Gulf, and with boisterous wind behind them were running rapidly towards the east. They sailed towards the Newfoundland shore, caught sight of the double cape, and then, heading north again, came to Blanc-Sablon on August 9th, 1534. Here they lay for a few days to prepare for the homeward voyage, and on August 15th they were underway once more for the passage of Belle Isle and the open sea. And after that, upon August 15th, so ends Cartier's narrative, being the feast of the Assumption of Our Lady, after that we had our service, we all together departed from the port of Blanc-Sablon, and with happy and prosperous weather we came into the middle of the sea that is between Newfoundland and Brittany, in which place we were tossed and turmoiled 3 days long, with great storms and windy tempests coming from the east, which, with the aid and assistance of God, we suffered. Then had we fair weather, and upon the 5th of September, In this said year, we came to the port of St. Malo, whence we departed. Another source. During the voyage back to France in 1534, Cartier learned from the two native sons, Domagaya and Taignoagny, who had kidnapped from Iroquois Chief Donnacona, that their father's village of Stadaconan, or present-day Quebec, was called Canada. Cartier wrote the name Canada on his charts and maps, perhaps to mark the land belonging to Chief Donnacona's tribe. This is the first recorded use of the name Canada and the name by which the country would become known. On September 5th, Cartier arrived in France and presented Domagaya and Taignoagny and the gifts from Chief Donnacona to the king. Cartier was quickly granted a new commission to return to the New World the following year. During their stay in France, Domagaya and Taignoagny learned enough French to become moderately conversant in the language. They told Cartier that beyond their village of Stadaconan, which lay upriver from the spot where they had first encountered each other, lay Hochelaga, or present-day Montreal, another Iroquois village. Cartier was excited to learn that what he had thought was just a large bay was actually the mouth of a large inland river. He was convinced he had found an inland route to the Pacific Ocean. Another source. Jacques Cartier's first voyage was effectively a failure, but upon his return to France on September 5th, 1534, he remained optimistic. With Domagaya and Taignoagny, Donnacona's two sons, as captives, he had evidence of the world overseas. Their stories managed to convince King Francis I that it was worthwhile to send Cartier back on another expedition to Canada, the name the two Iroquois gave to their father's village, and the name Cartier had added to his map. Domagaya and Taignoagny found themselves immersed in the court of Francis I at the height of the Renaissance, amidst dukes and duchesses, artists, and scholars. Among them was prominent clergyman André Thevet. He was a cosmographer responsible to the king for unraveling the mysteries of the world. The king was hoping that even though this country did not bring him much revenue, it would at least bring him immortal honor and the grace of God to have rescued this barbarous people from ignorance and to render it to the Christian Church, Thevet wrote. From his chambers in Paris, Thevet conjured a myth of a native North America that was godless yet surprisingly peaceful. In Domagaya and Taignoagny, he saw a simple nobility, a people who lived a blissful existence, and who could be easily conquered. They have neither cities nor castles nor machines of war like us, he wrote. And so, in May 1535, Cartier set off with 3 ships instead of 2, and 110 men rather than the 61 on his first voyage. He was buoyed by his 2 guides' descriptions of a river leading to the village of Stadaconan and to Hochelaga, the Iroquois settlement at the present site of Montreal. Let's look at André Thevet. Dictionary of Canadian Biography describes him as a Franciscan friar, the first French historian to describe America, born in 1502 in Angoulême, France, and died in 1590 in Paris, France. Thevet embarked for the East in circa 1537, where he traveled for 5 or 6 years. He claimed to have come to America in 1550 with the pilot Guillaume Testu, but this statement is now generally considered to be false. Skipping down, elevated to the position of almoner to Catherine de Medici, he later became historiographer and cosmographer to the king, Francis I. A bogus scholar and naive compiler of facts, he recorded indiscriminately everything he heard and read, while at the same time creating the impression that he himself had actually visited the countries, including North America, which he described. The McGill Queen's University Press has an interesting overview. André Thevet was one of the most widely traveled Frenchmen of the 16th century, visiting almost all the main countries and regions of Western Europe, the Near East, and Brazil. He served 4 consecutive French kings, beginning with Henry II, as royal cosmographer and garde des singularités. As cosmographer, he wrote 3 major books dealing with the discovery and subsequent exploration of the New World: Les Singularités de la France Antarctique in 1556, La Cosmographie Universelle 1575, and La Grande Insulaire, which is unpublished, 1586. Although the portions of these works devoted to South America have received considerable attention from scholars, Thevet's work on North America has remained inaccessible to students of the Age of Discovery. Professors Schlesinger and Stabler have now added Thevet to the list of enjoyable books by early European explorers of North America. Although credulous, egotistical, and sometimes something of a liar, Thevet provides a fascinating record of the period and an invaluable perspective on the events and opinions of the time. As the editors point out, much of his information may have come from conversations with Jacques Cartier, Sébastien Cabot, and Sieur de Roberval. Much of Thevet's work on North America, including Mexico, is translated here into English for the first time. The material is drawn from rare 16th century books and from previously unpublished manuscripts. Wikipedia has listed that Thevet was born in Angoulême, France. At 10 years of age, he entered the convent of Franciscans of Angoulême. Not very much impressed by religion, he preferred to read books. He visited Italy at the same time as Guillaume Rondelet. In 1549, thanks to the support of John Cardinal of Lorraine, he embarked in an extended exploration trip to Asia, Greece, Rhodes, Palestine, and Egypt. He accompanied the French ambassador Gabriel de Louet to Istanbul. Upon his return to France in 1554, he published an account of this voyage under the title Cosmography of the Levant. Almost immediately after this, he set sail again as chaplain of the fleet of Vice Admiral Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon to colonize Brazil. In the New World, he collected many specimens of animals, plants, and minerals, as well as aboriginal potteries and weapons. Thevet died in Paris. Another source says of André Thevet, in early life he was compelled to enter the Franciscan monastery, where he dedicated himself to his studies, being gifted with a prodigious memory, although not much inclined towards religion. Thevet was protege of Francis I, who entrusted him with various missions. ... So let's examine these dates briefly. Dannacona's sons, Domagaya and Taignoagny, were in France from September 1534 to May 1535, before Cartier left with them back to the New World. So during this time, they were in the presence of King Francis I and also André Thevet. Let's examine something else. From the Jesuits by John W. O'Malley, S.J., we have the list: Ignatius Loyola, Francis Xavier, Pierre Favre, Diego Lainez, Alfonso Salmeron, Nicolas Bobadilla, Simeon Rodriguez, Claude J., Paches Brouet, and Jean Couture. It's noted by 1537 the 10 holding their Masters of Arts degrees from the University of Paris arrived in Venice. So by that we note that at least in 1534 these 10 men were at the University of Paris. Did they cross paths with André Thevet, King Francis I, and Dannacona's sons? Let's revisit page 2 of the Jesuits by John O'Malley, S.J. On August 15th, during a Mass celebrated by Favre, the only priest among them at the time, they bound themselves to this course of action as well as to a life of poverty. Since they all, in fact, intended to be ordained, they were already committed to a life of celibate chastity. They did not realize at the time that on that fateful August 15th, 1534, they took the first step that led 6 years later to the founding of the Society of Jesus. Before these 7 left Paris to begin their journey, they were joined by 3 more students, Claude, Paches Brouet, and Jean Couture. By 1537, the 10 now holding the prestigious Masters of Arts degrees from the University of Paris had arrived in Venice. They were ordained and awaited passage eastward. As they waited, they engaged in preaching and other ministries in northern and central Italy. When asked who they were, they now responded that they were members of a Brotherhood of Jesus, in Italian, Una Compagnia de Gesù, in Latin, Societas Jesu. We remember at this time, September 25th, up to September 25th, 1534, that Pope Clement VII reigned. He's a Medici Pope, Giulio di Giuliano de' Medici, and he was replaced by Paul III on October 13, 1534. A Farnese Pope, Alessandro Farnese. Again, revisiting the Jesuits by John O'Malley, page 4. When the 10 founders drew up the formula, they seemed to envisage the society as an updated version of the so-called mendicant orders, such as the Dominicans and Franciscans founded in the 13th century. They described themselves as engaging primarily in the same ministries of preaching and hearing confessions. They, like the Dominicans and Franciscans, saw these ministries as almost by definition itinerant and without geographical limits, which thus implicitly entailed overseas missions. They, in fact, conceived the society as essentially a missionary order. In the formula, the founders made explicit dedication to missions anywhere in the world by a special vow that obliged them to be ready to travel among the Turks, or to the New World, or to the Lutherans, or to any others, whether infidels or faithful. Because this vow was in addition to the customary 3 of poverty, chastity, and obedience, it is commonly referred to as the 4th vow. Although they specified the Pope as the one who would send them on these missions, they soon realized this provision was impracticable, and in their constitutions they invested the superior general with the primary responsibility in this regard. Nonetheless, the Jesuits and others came to interpret the vow as giving to society a special relationship to the papacy. It was not, however, as it is often erroneously described, a vow of loyalty to the Pope. It was a vow to be missionaries. We remember at this point in our exploration that Donnacona's 2 sons were in France for 7 months, from September 1534 to May 1535, and under care of Jacques Cartier, King Francis I, Franciscan priest André Thevet, and almost assuredly in contact with the 10 men who would become the foundation of the Jesuit order. I think this is a good point to wrap up. Thank you for joining me. Video number 3. For the Sarucci team, Johnny, Doc Felipe, Eric, Reply All George, Greg. This is Hawkeye. Until next time, ciao.